Day 6 of the Great War, the Homefront. So we're talking about World War I, or the Great War, because at the time, obviously, no one knew it was going to be the first of two. And the question for today is, to what extent did the war affect the home front? And we're going to focus on Russia and Germany. Recap of the war so far. You already know this. The Western Front, the war in France, between France and Germany, involved trench warfare. It involved gas masks and gas attacks and a bunch of technology. Then we talked about the war on the Eastern Front in Russia and how it was more of a low-tech war, um, which is why I'm exemplifying it in this picture of horses. It was a war of movement. It happened across broad swathes of Russian farmland, the Carpathian Mountains, all of that we've already reviewed. And then we also have the war in East Africa, the German colony of East Africa. We have Letao Vorbeck. We have the Askari soldiers in what is today Tanzania. All of that was referenced in a previous lesson. And today, this brings us to the home front, the people who are fighting on the front of the war that is at home. Question number 1, how did propaganda affect the way the German Homefront felt about the Great War? We have two parts to this picture. One part is the reality at home, and the other part is the propaganda, the imagined ideal version. So on the reality of the home front portion, you have women working in a factory making munitions, making, perhaps those are artillery shells. We also have, there towards the middle, children collecting scrap metal. This happened in Germany. It also happened in places like Britain and France, but since we're talking about Germany right now, kids collecting scrap metal, the metal being used in factories to make munitions for the war. Why are kids collecting scrap metal? Well, largely because of the British blockade that prevented Germany from getting new metal from its colonies, from getting metal on the world market. And the same thing in reverse for places like Britain and elsewhere. These blockades were very successful. It meant that Germany needed more supplies, and they're going to have to find it all at home. This brings us to the picture at the bottom left, which is people lined up for food, a food line, a bread line, so to speak. Lines like this one in Britain, also similarly happening in Germany. The German home front experienced food shortages and a little bit of rationing. And the home front public was generally willing to suffer and to struggle and to endure these hardships because of the propaganda that we see on the right. German soldiers in the military were given postcards to send home to their loved ones, to send them messages of encouragement. Oh, I miss you, sweetheart. I love you, my children, or whatever. On one side of the postcard, though, were images like these that showed the war going really well. They showed the soldiers relaxing in the sun in France on the grass, leisurely writing letters. They showed the soldiers on the Eastern Front cheering for their commanders. Yes, some of the soldiers are wounded, but they're cheerfully excited. They're still very in favor of the war. Despite the fact that 10 million people are going to die in this war, the attitude promoted by these postcards was not one that showed death and destruction, but one that was encouraging. People were struggling, people were hungry, people were tired, were working hard on the home front, but the propaganda helped them to feel like they were doing a good thing and that they were struggling for a good cause. Question number 2, why did attitudes towards war on the Russian home front change during the Great War? So Russia has kind of a different experience than Germany. If Germany had a lousy experience during the war, Russia's experience was 10 times worse. The Tsar of Russia, fielded the biggest army that basically anybody had ever seen, but they had shortages in everything much sooner than all of the other combatants. You have a food line here in the top right side of the picture, and different from in Germany and in Britain, the food lines in Russia were guarded by the military. That's military guards on the horse there and next to him. Food shortages were so bad that there were food riots across Russia, especially in the cities. That's what's going on in this illustration on the right. As you know from your previous study of history, what happens in a country where there's not enough food and there's angry women who can't feed their children? We saw this in the French Revolution. We're starting to see revolts. We're starting to see rebellions. Women are taking matters into their own hands. We also have devastation across Russia that's impossible to hide from the civilians. We have two Russian peasant men in the photo that's been colorized over here on the left, an actual photo from back then that's been sort of photoshopped with color into it. But the homeless population, the displaced populations, the refugees in Russia was a huge problem that we kind of tend to forget about in the English speaking world. Most of the battles on the Eastern Front that weren't fought in the mountains were fought on Russian farmland. So Russian peasants were displaced and they ran away from their farms and they moved to the cities. Some of the cities, had hundreds of thousands of new refugees who were poor, uneducated peasant farmers who basically became giant populations of homeless, starving people. So homelessness and refugees in cities, food lines and food shortages, riots and vandalism and stuff in order to get food. Plus, in addition to all of that, the crowded hospitals full of wounded soldiers. So at the bottom of the screen in the center, we have a crowded Petrograd hospital, wounded soldiers arriving in the hundreds of thousands. About 25% of the wounded soldiers are going to go back to combat, and the other 75% are going to stay sort of on permanent disability until they die a painful, slow death. One statistic to help understand why Russian attitudes were different from those in Germany and why their attitude was so much more negative. Russia sustained 1,811,000 soldiers killed in the war and 1,500,000 civilian deaths. So their civilian deaths are almost as high as their military deaths, not to mention wounded casualties and missing in action. This brings us to our last question. How did Russian soldiers' attitudes change from nationalist pride to sort of cynical, negative, feeling doomed? Cynicism means like distrust of other people, distrust of other people's motives, a lack of faith, a lack of trust in other people, and sort of an attitude that assumes that everyone's acting selfishly, and so one might as well act selfishly as well. The beginning of the war, Russian soldiers felt a lot like this propaganda poster on the right, like they're going to ride on a horse and stab the enemy in the eye, so to speak, stab the Germans in the eye. This early patriotism went away very quickly after the first couple of major battles, where, as we've seen before, tens of thousands of soldiers died, but also most of the officer class, most of the middle management of the military. And so the military is going to become a very negative place and sort of a very disorganized place. With the breakdown in leadership leads us to this interesting picture on the bottom center. We don't really know. I have not been able to find a reliable source for exactly what's going on in this picture, but historians have speculated one of two likely things are going on here. We have Russian soldiers in Russian uniforms here, soldiers in Austrian uniforms here, and soldiers in Russian uniforms here. So why? What are they doing? They seem to be smiling and laughing. They're standing around like a fire together. It seems to be a relatively amicable, friendly situation. Are they horsing around? Are they joking around? Are some of these men prisoners? We don't know, but there's sort of one of two options. One, prisoners or not, the enemy is fraternizing, is socializing, is cheerfully interacting with the enemy. So like the Russians and the Austrians are interacting with each other cheerfully, which you're not supposed to see for enemies. The other option is that the two men in the center are actually Russian soldiers who have looted Austrian uniforms and helmets from dead Austrian soldiers on the battlefield, and they're doing some sort of um, dark horsing around thing. And it's so cold, nobody really cares what uniform you're even wearing. Maybe they're wearing Austrian helmets to joke around. Either way, this is not an example of perfect military discipline. As the death tolls increased, as the number of prisoners taken by Germany and Austria increased, you get to 1916, 1917, and you end up with the Russian military um, conscripting and recruiting young boys. This is a photo from a German prisoner of war camp. This is a Russian boy soldier. Boy soldiers as young as 12 years old served in the army. And then over here on the right, the legendary battalions of death, the legendary all women battalions, volunteered to join the military in the last stages of the war in 1917. These women, 5,000 of them saw combat directly on the front lines, and in their segregated all women units, they were able to sort of sidestep a lot of the normal rejection of including women in the military. Rather than integrating women into the military, they had their own segregated units. They saw action at the front, and many of them were commended for their bravery and honestly vicious actions. The other thing, and the last thing that contributes to this sense of cynicism, is that there are 439,000 roughly missing Russian soldiers, missing in action, MIA, gone. Nobody knows what happened to them. They are unaccounted for. The Russian army estimated that number to be much lower. The Russian civilian population estimated that number to be much higher. In an era before dog tags, without military ID tags or anything like that, it's really, really hard to keep track of missing people. Some of them probably were blown to smithereens in an exploding shell or buried in a landslide of dirt or something, fell off of a mountain, fell into a river, standard things like that. However, 400,000, give or take, is a very large number of missing, unaccounted for soldiers. And so it's not impossible to imagine that a large percentage of them just abandoned their posts and ran away, which lends a little bit more significance to this picture here. Maybe some of them just picked up Austrian uniforms and walked on into Austria. It's really hard to know what actually happened. So you have these three questions, answer them separately first, then keep those and add a sort of concluding paragraph to tie them all together. A summary of your summaries. To what extent did the war affect the home front? Did it affect it a lot, a little, a great amount, a small amount? And remember that this question asks to what extent. So you can say it affected Russia a large amount and Germany an even larger amount. Do your best.